Thank you. Have you read the book?
I have read the book.
This is a joke because Jackie narrated the audiobook. So I'm Margaret. I'm on tour right now. Do folks mind if I unmask while I'm talking? I guess, okay. I'm on tour right now with the Sapling Cage, and what's funny is that, so normally what I say here is that, but rather than read from the book, I'm going to read a bunch of folklore set in the same world. But in addition to that, what I'm also going to do is trick Jackie into reading me some of the book, because she read me the first chapter on one of my podcasts, and I haven't listened to the audiobook yet. Not because it's just like weird to listen to your own audiobook. But it'll be even weirder when I make Jackie read me part of the book. I did warn her this beforehand.
You did,
yeah.
And I do appreciate the heads up you gave me. And yeah, we'll see how this goes, because usually it's just me and a microphone in my booth, and I get as many takes as I want. But with tonight, it's going to be theater rules, baby. So we'll see how this goes.
Well, if you do anything wrong, just lead into it and just change the text entirely.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Naturally.
This is the Choose Your Own Adventure version of legally distinct from Choose Your Own Adventure. I went on a tour once for my legally distinct from Choose Your Own Adventure book called What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower. And the book says on the front, being an adventure of your own choosing, very prominently, but I accidentally posted to my blog, I'm going on a Choose Your Own Adventure book tour, and I got a very formal and stern email informing me that I was not going on a Choose Your Own Adventure book tour. So ever since, I've been very clear that that's not what's happening.
Indeed.
But yeah, no, change anything you want in it, and then don't tell us. And so you all will have to actually read the book in order to find out. And so Jackie is going to read a little bit, then I'm going to read a little bit, and we'll do some question and answer, and then if folks want, I can sign some books. Unfortunately, I don't know if y'all knew this, but the economy's in shambles, and so supply chains are all fucked up. I don't know what your rules of live streaming are.
That's fine.
Okay. And so only a couple copies of the book are here, and if they sell out, then I can sign little book plates for anyone who wants. I can sign those anyway, even if you don't want to buy the book. I'll sign a little book plate. You can put whatever book you want. I signed an Errico Malatesta book the other day. That man has been dead for a long time. Or has he?
Oh, dun dun.
But anyway, so Jackie,
do you want to say a little bit about, just in case people don't know what this book is about? Do we want to just give a little context of?
So, well, especially since you're going to be reading from chapter 2, so explain what's happened. So this book is a story about a young person who wants to go be a witch, but she has a problem, which is that she's a boy. And her best friend has a problem in which she has been promised to the witches and doesn't want to be a witch. So they switch places, and young Lorel goes off to join the witches by dressing up as a girl, and then is like, actually, I think I am a girl. And hijinks ensue. And then it's funny because we were talking earlier, and I was like, well, it's not actually a book about that. That's just the setup. It's a book that's a transparent metaphor for climate change, because people are destroying the environment by... Well, I don't want to tell you what they're doing. But in the very beginning of the first book, the first chapter, Lorel has decided to go be a witch and has been initiated into the witches, or has been taken off by the witches. And so she has no idea what's happening, more or less, and now she's just walking away from the home that she spent her first 16 years of her life, is where we start.
Sorry, bear with me for just a sec.
This is a really clever object, this don't roll thing.
All right. 2. For half an hour or more, we walked in silence. Even the night birds seemed to grow quiet. I knew where we were headed. Another 5 minutes, I knew where we were headed. Another 5 minutes, and we were there. The long abandoned hut had walls of rough-hewn marble blocks, some as large as a mule. It had been built by giants, I'd heard. It just stood at the edge of the creek, though 1,000 years of erosion had begun to wear away at its foundation. A glint of the gibbous moon reflected off the water, but It was hard to see the building clearly in the dark forest. That didn't matter. Lane and I had been there 100 times. When we were younger, we'd climbed over the roof to pretend to be brigands fighting off imaginary knights, or we dug holes in the ground nearby to plant an imaginary garden. The past few years, we'd come just to talk, to sit in the window frame and watch birds in the trees nearby. We'd never stayed overnight, though. It was haunted, we told one another. Witches probably slept there and did their magic in the fire pit at its center. We'd been right, apparently. The coven formed a semicircle around the 10-foot-tall doorway, and the young witch herded me and the other recruit to the side. It was one of the crones, the one who'd inspected me in the square, who broke the spell of silence.
Lorel of the Vine, present yourself.
The other recruit stared at me, her eyes filled with, worry? Fear? Certainly, whatever the initiation rite entailed, it wouldn't hurt me, would it? I approached the semicircle.
When you were nothing but a whim in your mother's belly, myself and 2 others of the Vine drove a monster away from Ledston. You've heard this story?
I nodded. This witch must be Dame Electoria, because her 2 companions died on the tusks of Sir Hillick the monster after he transformed himself into a boar. I'd heard the story 1,000 times in 1,000 ways, because the confrontation had taken place on market day, and everyone who saw it seemed to have seen something slightly different.
Why were you promised to the Order?
Dame Electoria asked. To replace the lives the Order lost defending Ledston, I answered, without thinking much about it.
No,
Dame Electoria said.
We lost 2 lives, yet we only asked for 1. Why were you promised to the Order?
The question caught me off guard the second time. I looked at the other witches as though their faces might betray the answer. Because, I stammered. I thought hard about the little I knew of witches. Pacts and bargains were so much a part of the stories. Because everything must bear a cost?
Not a cost like merchants might ask,
Dame Electoria said. She smiled at my answer, even as she corrected me.
But power without sacrifice is the only real evil in this world. Ledston wanted us, wanted the power we represent. We asked for sacrifice to maintain balance. This is the first lesson, the lesson which all the others come from. There is no good in this world. The 2 opposing forces at work are balance and evil.
What if I hadn't wanted to be a witch? I asked. Electoria's mesmerizing smile grew wider.
Then balance would have come in other ways.
I was that balance. Since Lane hadn't joined the witches, I had. My mother had made that sacrifice in place of Leona. Had she known that? The middle-aged witch began a song. I didn't understand the words, if there were words, and the melody followed no pattern or notes I could recognize. It was an alien music, unsettling. More like birdsong or the cries of foxes than the music that people make. When a second witch joined her, though, she harmonized somehow. Then a third. Then the singer stepped aside and formed a triangle around us. It was magic. For the first time in my life, I was witnessing magic. The strange music felt like a wall around me, holding me in. The world beyond the singers was an endless expanse of red light. The trees were gone. The hut was gone. The other recruit was gone. It was just me and the witches. I was dizzy.
Lorel of the Vine?
The witches said, each in their own voices, but so coordinated it was like one entity spoke through them. The 3 singers somehow continued to sing while they spoke.
Will you accept the teachings of the Order?
Yes, I said.
Will you pursue balance and accept the cost of power?
Yes, I said.
Will you protect your sisters of the Vine and accept their protection in return?
Yes. First, one singer dropped the thread of music, then another. Finally, the third sang one last note, and the wall of sound went down. The red plains disappeared, and the forest returned. It was like I'd been spinning, and suddenly I'd stopped. I couldn't decide if I should throw up, sit down, or pass out. I passed out. I woke just before dawn with the first morning call of a thrush. Birdsong reminded me of the witch's eerie song the night before, and the magic it brought about. I opened my eyes and stared for a while at the smooth bronze skin of the large madrone tree above me, its limbs like muscles. I was on my back on a flat rock beside the river. Cold seeped through the stone and into me, and I had only a threadbare wool blanket for warmth, yet I'd slept well. Someone had put me to bed. Someone might have seen my body. Frenzied with fear, I lifted the blanket to check, but I was still in the same dress I'd worn the night before. I turned on my side and saw a few witches still sleeping, with one quietly preparing a morning fire. I hadn't been found out then, or they would have left me. Or worse. I should have been sore after sleeping on rock, but when I stood up, nothing in my body complained. I'd never had a better night's sleep. "Morning, whelp," the young witch with the wound across her face said to me. She leaned heavily on her crutch, but her shoulders were broad, and she looked strong. The wound across her face was healing badly, a stripe of blood red edged by the gross pale white of dying skin. It ran from her temple to her chin, just missing her eye. "I'm scarcely a whelp," I said. "If you make it a year, you're an apprentice. Then, when we decide you're ready, a witch. Right now, though, you're a whelp." "Okay," I said, though I still bristled at the label. "I'm Dame Lament," she offered by way of introduction. It had always seemed strange to me that witches used the same formal titles as knights. A woman knight was a dame. A man knight was a sir. All witches were dames, of course. Would I be a sir? "Laurel," I said. "I know." Of course she knew. I blushed my embarrassment. "You know how to handle a boar spear, Laurel? You're a tall enough girl." I've never used one," I said, stumbling over my words. The boys in my village..." "Wouldn't let a girl in on the hunt, then?" Lament asked. Something like that. The men in town had always brought boys along to hunt, and occasionally one of the older girls, but I'd never been invited. I was too scrawny, too feminine. "Well, today you'll come with me. I bet you know this area." "I do," I said. "This hut? My friend Lane and I come here all the time, and there are crayfish in the creek, and if you go about 10 minutes upstream, you'll reach a pool where..." But my audience was walking away from me while I rattled on. "Well, Pax," Lament said, nudging the other recruit with the foot of her crutch, "it's time to be up." "I want to sleep," the other recruit said, curled on her side. Lane always complained when she was woken up, too. "The Great Mother never sleeps, and it's a curse that any of us must at all," Lament said. "To rot with the Great Mother. Sleeping is great, and it's not even daytime yet. Not really." Don't care. Get up, or I'll turn you into a fish." Would she really? She sounded like she meant it. Hex rose to her feet. She was a few inches shorter than me, but wider set and strong. No one could replace Lane. Not really, but I was happy I might find a friend. "Grab a spear," Lament told her. "We're off to hunt."
I really like listening to you read this story.
Thank you.
I guess I probably will eventually listen to audiobook.
I had a really good time with it.
Yeah.
Genuinely. My job is extra fun when the writing is good, and the writing is really good on this one, so thank you
That's what I
again.
hear, yeah. I don't know. I've been looking forward to this event in particular to meet Jackie in person since she first agreed to do the narration, and it's nice to hear. I don't know. It's nice to hear someone who is an actor do the things that you do. And if people want to check out other books you've narrated, do you have other books that you've narrated?
I do have other books that I've narrated. If you look up my name on Audible, you'll find my list, and you can also head to my website, jackiemalosh.com, and you'll see my whole catalog of things I have done. But yeah. I don't have anything in particular to plug right now. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm so used to with podcasting being like, and now what do you have to plug? Anyway, we'll be back from these ads. No, I'm sorry.
The concept of potatoes.
Yeah. Medieval weapons. That's my new sponsor. Okay, so when I was like, I'm going to go on book tour, I'm going to not read from the book every night, because if I read from the book every night, I'm going to eventually get bored of it. And so instead, I started writing all this folklore. And I told my publisher, I was like, hey, instead of working on the second book, I've written all this folklore. And she was like, that's great. You know that the second book is due. And I was like, yeah, no, and I have all this folklore. And so my long-suffering publisher. So I've been writing a whole bunch of folklore, and what I've been really enjoying doing, this takes place in a country called Cekon, and there's the highlands and the lowlands in this country, and the highlands see themselves as more good and classist against the lowlands people, basically, right? And I've been reading all this folklore in general for other stuff, and one of my favorite sort of gets quotes here, but one of the most interesting things to me about folklore is that most folklore is an oral tradition, right? And then eventually it kind of gets written down. And usually, if you're reading in English, the way it got written down is some like asshole with a pith helmet from England was like, I mean, he probably didn't literally have a pith helmet, but it's more fun to imagine him that way, was like, I'm in Japan or Ukraine or Mexico. Isn't it weird the stuff people say here? They have wacky stories. Let me write them down, you know? And but it's funny because it's like sometimes that's the only that's the oldest available written versions of these things, you know, in the same way that like we only have like the Christian interpretation of like Norse gods, right? Because like all of that stuff was written down by some Icelandic priest named Snorri. Which was not one of the seven dwarves, I think. And so I was like, okay, so not only am I going to write a bunch of in-world fiction within my world, I'm going to write it as if a Highlands person is writing Lowlands folklore, because that would be more fun to me. And I first got my start writing like in-world fiction because I realized it was really fun. I run a lot of it used to be Dungeons and Dragons. Now I mostly run Pathfinder and this other game that I help write called Penumbra City. And one of my favorite things to do, because I'm a terrible person, is write a whole bunch of like in-game stuff and put it in like the pockets of the people that they kill. Because when you play D&D, you end up like killing a lot of people, which is like not always the way you should have solved any given problem. And so they're like, they kill like this like guard or whatever, and then they're like searching for like magic loot, and instead they find like letters I've written between him and his husband back home where he like can't wait to get back, or like art criticism that he's like working on, or poetry, or like and it's kind of fun. My most recent campaign, I've like mapped out the plot of like 17 or so books in this series, and they're like all running around trying to collect all of the Lucette the Vampiress books instead of like stopping Lucette the Vampiress. And anyway, so I've been enjoying doing that a lot. And so I decided to write this folklore set in Cekon. And I'm going to read you all one story today. And there's going to be a bunch more. I was going to have this whole zine ready for tour with like 7 stories. And it was all going to be illustrated because my friend Robin was like, oh my God, I'd love to illustrate it. Can I illustrate it? And I was like, absolutely. And she was like, when do you need it by? And I was like, I leave for tour in 3 weeks. And she was like, no. And so it's not out as a zine yet. But eventually, anyone who backs it on Kickstarter will get a digital version of the zine for free with all the art and stuff. And then, because I promised like one story set in the same world. And so then I was like, what if I write 7? And my publisher's like, I'd rather you wrote the book. And but I will absolutely write it. And then also a publisher I work with called Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, which is a collectively run small press, will put out the zine also in print form. But you all can hear one of the stories now. And I wrote this whole, I don't have time to read the whole introduction to the zine, but I absolutely wrote the like art criticism of the thing. And I'm gonna read you like a paragraph of it. There are so many ways in which their tales differ from our own. Their heroes tend to be low-born and straightforward, sometimes even brutish. Many tales avoid any hint of moralizing and ethical instruction found in our stories that were written at high elevation, where the air is clearer and the sun is brighter. And many of their stories end abruptly and often violently. When the stories do contain moral lessons, such as most of the tales of the peasant-turned-knight Sir Rockdaw, the lessons might come across as improper, even vulgar. They present an inverted hierarchy in which bumbling royals are saved and set back on their thrones by good and noble common folk, who regularly treat their own social betters as if they were naught but squabbling infants incapable of feeding themselves. And so that's what I'm going to read you all, is a story of Sir Rockdaw.
Hell yeah.
And let me see if I can open this with one hand. I succeeded.
Nailed it.
I'm so good at this. This story is called How the Good Knight Rockdaw Saved a Mediocre Baron and Earned His Sword. Back long ago, in the age between the Old Kingdom and the Mad King's reign, there was a knight named Sir Rockdaw who rode for Baron Gressel. If you don't remember Baron Gressel, it's because there's nothing to remember him by, but his portrait among so many others in the long halls of Deadman Castle. Sir Rockdaw, however, we remember. Sir Rockdaw was an odd fellow, the sort to stand out in any crowd of knights. He was handsome enough with a mustache to remember and warm chestnut eyes. He was tall and strong and carried himself well, but he was common-born, and he was not young. He'd lived an entire life, in fact, before he found himself a knight. He was a widower twice over, father of 7 daughters and grandfather to 12 granddaughters, before he ever so much as lifted a sword. Long had his family worked the forests west of Deadman Castle, hunting and logging. On most maps, this area is called Deadman Forest. To the scattered families who live just outside of it, venturing in to harvest a meager living from within, it's just the dark forest. They call it that because the mists are so thick, the canopy so thick, the underbrush so thick, that the sun scarcely touches the forest floor. Before he was the good knight Rockdaw, when he was just Papa to his daughters, when he was just Gramps to his granddaughters, when he was just Rockdaw to his friends at the common house, he rose with the dawn and slept with the sunset, as he'd done for each of his 45 years. Each night he slept in a one-room stone house built by his grandma and her brothers, as he'd done for each of his 45 years. Each night he set a bowl of tea under the linden for the Great Mother, as he'd done for each of his 45 years. Each night he dreamt of the dark forest, as he'd done for each of his 45 years. It happened bright and early one day that Rockdaw was attending to the chores in the yard outside that stone house, mending the fence that held back the forest, when he heard a shout from deep in the mist beyond, the sound of a man in fright. As his own mother had told him, as his own grandma had told him, if you hear something in the dark forest, if you hear someone shouting in the dark forest, in the deep of the woods beyond the paths of men, if you hear someone shouting when the sun first creeps over the horizon and casts its holy gaze upon every corner of Cekon but the dark forest, if you hear someone shouting from the forest, well, no, you didn't. So that morning when Rockdaw heard shouting, he listened to what his mother had told him and what his grandma had told him, and he didn't listen to the shouting. There were many things in the dark forest, and very few of them were people in need of help. You see, when the sun begins to rise, the creatures of the night begin to despair, at least those who hadn't had any luck the night before with hunting. And so it's at dawn that they pull out all the stops. It's at dawn that they'll try all the tricks. It's at dawn they'll do anything, try anything, rather than go to bed hungry. Rockdaw heard the shouting and paid it no heed. He sang to himself a little song, a work song, while he pulled a broken picket from his family's fence and set a new one in its place. Work songs, like all songs, are better sung in company, but Rockdaw had no company that morning, so he sang alone. A minute went by, and still the creature in the woods shrieked and screamed. 10 minutes went by, and still the creature in the woods screeched and squalled. 20 minutes went by, and still the creature in the woods hollered and howled. But after 30 minutes, the voice was haggard and hoarse. As Rockdaw drove the final picket into the soft earth, tap, tap, whack with his mallet, he thought about what he was hearing. Maybe, he said to himself, because people who spend too much time alone at the edge of the woods talk to themselves, don't ask the author how she knows. Maybe it's a person in trouble. And so Rockdaw, the proud papa to 7 daughters, proud gramps to 12 granddaughters, put his mallet through the iron loop in his belt, opened the gate to the fence in his yard, and strode out into the misty dark forest. He whistled a tune his father had taught him, a tune that would not drive back the mists, but would keep them from clouding his thoughts with fear. "Help me," he heard. While there are many things in the woods that could sound like a human in pain, from foxes on up, there weren't so many creatures or monsters that could put words together. Rockdaw left the path he walked more days than not, and went straight into the forest after the noise. "Help," he heard again, not long after. Then soon enough, he saw the source of the screaming. It was not a monster of the woods at all, but a baron. A monster of the castle, one might say. This particular baron, Baron Gressel, was hanging upside down about 10 feet in the air, tied by his feet to the stout limb of a stout oak. "Why, Baron Gressel," Rockdaw said, for he recognized the man immediately by the fine velvet he wore. "Why are you hanging upside down in the dark forest?" "I came hunting," the baron replied, though his voice was so hoarse it took Rockdaw a moment to understand him. It was true. A fine yew bow lay on the ground beneath him, that fine-fletched arrows were scattered across the forest floor. "I came hunting alone because my father hunted alone, and now I've been strung up by some horrid monster." Rockdaw looked closer at the scene and realized what held the baron aloft was not a rope of hemp, not a rope of straw, nor cotton, nor any other fiber spun from plants. The baron was held aloft by a rope woven of sinew, in fact. The baron, therefore, had been caught by a hallows beetle, a monster the size of a dog that hunted with ropes it made from previous prey. Ironically, the hallows beetle was indeed among the creatures that could scream like a fox, scream like a man, scream like the gates to the nethers had been opened, though, of course, it was the baron that Rockdaw had heard. "Get me down from here immediately," Baron Gressel said. "I am your liege, and you will do as I say." "Well, now you've put me into a predicament," Rockdaw said. He took a piece of licorice root out of a pouch on his belt and began to chew it, as he often did when he had a complex question to mull over. "You are not my liege at all, Baron Gressel, because I am not your feudal vassal. I'm common-born, and I owe you only the respect I might give anyone in these woods. Anything you want, it's yours. Get me down." "I don't want anything," Rockdaw said. "Not anything that would not be evil to ask for. I am rich enough as it is, for I have 7 daughters, and I have 12 granddaughters. I am a widower, though, and the only thing I want is for the company of those who I will not see again until the mists take me, when I will be off to see my lost wives and my own mother, and also the mother of us all." Rockdaw thought for a moment. "I would, though, quite like to be a knight. The good knight Rockdaw. It has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? I'll let you down either way, but why don't you give it a thought?" Yes, just get me down," the baron shouted. "Hurry, before the beast returns." Rockdaw knew that the hallows beetle was likely just out of sight, waiting for the baron to stop yelling, stop thrashing, stop fighting. The hallows beetle was likely waiting so it could climb the oak and climb the branch and eat the baron up and make a rope from his sinew and a nest from his bones. There wasn't much time at all. But Rockdaw had promised the baron he would do for him what he might do for anyone he might find in the woods, and that meant a rescue. So Rockdaw climbed the stout tree, thinking all the while he was getting too old for the work of clambering up trees. He climbed out the stout branch, wondering why the baron and his father, the baron, before him, had insisted on hunting in the dark woods alone. He reached the rope of sinew, wondering why a man without the sense not to wander the dark woods alone, who didn't even know how a hallows beetle caught its prey, would be in charge of an entire barony. He pulled out his knife, wondering what would happen to the baron when the man fell 10 feet onto his head on the forest floor. Then he cut the rope, and the baron fell, and though he was heavily concussed, he survived. So then at least one of Rockdaw's questions had been answered. The hallows beetle had indeed been watching, and it skittered into the clearing, shiny and blue and green and gold, all at once. It saw the baron concussed on the ground, and it screamed, a fox scream, a human scream, a horrid scream. But Rockdoll, like his mother before him, like his grandma and her brothers, like his daughters, had faced such monsters before. He leapt from the tree, mallet in hand, questioning the life choices that had led him to leap from trees onto monsters, and landed on the Hallows beetle. Tap, tap, he rapped on the head of the beast. Tap, tap, whack, until its brain was good and scrambled. More scrambled than that of the Baron after his fall. And soon the beetle was dead. It was a shame to kill the beast in its way, because Hallows beetles rarely leave the forest, and they eat the soga birds, who are such a nuisance to those who live in the fields to the east. Rockdoll helped the Baron out of the dark woods and put him into the lumber cart he used to carry lumber to town after it had been milled and kilned, and rode the Baron back to Deadman Castle. True to his word, Baron Gressel knighted the good-knight Rockdoll, who in turn knighted 2 of his daughters immediately, and another one when she finally agreed to come home more often for the holidays. Rockdoll and his daughters, and later his granddaughters, had many adventures, saving the lives, but often not the dignity, of both deserving and undeserving souls. That's the story.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh.
So, well, I guess if you want to hear more, you should mostly just wait. Although some of them have been released, more Rockdoll stories have been released by that publisher, Strangers in the Tangled Wilderness, and you can hear a different voice actor read them, but I haven't announced it as much because I'm reading them on tour, and so I feel, anyway, whatever. But if you go to tangledwilderness.org, you can read more Rockdoll stories for now while I finish the rest of the thing and art comes in and stuff. But we have a little bit of time for questions, and then, if anyone has questions. You don't have to have questions. You could have questions. You are invited to have questions. Yes?
Will you ever be doing any more stories about Danielle and her crust punk gang?
Yeah, so the question
Because
is...
my name is Danielle, so I read that first book, and I was like, oh, it's me.
Amazing. So the question is whether I'm going to do more books in the Danielle Kane series. Yeah. And so there's 2 that came out from Tor several years ago. I just finished writing the 3rd book, and it'll probably be coming out from Strangers in the Tangled Wilderness, this publisher. I keep telling everyone to go. It's funny, I don't normally actually bring it up all that much, but it's a collective press, and I'm one of the people in it. And we agreed to publish the 3rd book, and it's going to be a collection of short fiction following the same characters, but as they talk about, basically as they tell stories on Samhain about their dead friends. And it's some of my favorite fiction that I've written, and it also has the darkest story I've ever written in it about fairies. Well, okay, to spoil part of it, because I feel really clever about this. Most of these stories have come from dreams. A lot of what I write comes from dreams. And this particular story came from, I had a dream where there were these like fairies or elves or whatever, and they came up with a system by which the only real tangible currency that actually holds value is an adult human skull. Because it's the only thing that's like 1-to-1 about, people or whatever, right? And it can't be a kid, because then you're cheating. And because I'm not going to write that story. That's too dark for me. You have to, it's like, hold this, Kafia. So that book will hopefully come out in, I think, February, but we haven't announced it yet. I only came up with the title really recently, and I haven't fully settled on it yet. But it's a small press, so we can kind of move faster with it. And then hopefully I'll go back to writing more of them, but I'm not allowed to until I finish the next book in this series. Yeah. Other questions? How do I like being back in Michigan so far? Wait, do I know you? Have we met before? Oh, yeah. A million years ago. Yeah, no, totally. I was like, when I was here last time, I was living in the woods in East Lansing. So this is better. That was a really dark period of my life, to be honest. But Lansing, and then I tried to catch a train in Battle Creek, and the cops were not happy with me, and they weren't happy with my support the ALF patch, and And I think maybe afterwards I learned that maybe there had been some like animal liberation actions in that area or whatever. And I'm just like this like crust punk trend, like really bad at hopping trains. I like hop trains out here, and then I was like, I don't know how to get anywhere anymore. And so then we like hitchhiked to Milwaukee, and then caught a train and ended up in Minneapolis, and then gave up on catching trains and whatever. Anyway, hopping trains is hard. Yes.
Support ALF.
Yeah, the question was, what year would that have been? Probably 2002.
If I can just throw in a little bit of context, apparently around the year 2000 on the MSU campus, there was a animal rights group that bombed Ag Hall, one of the tallest buildings on the campus.
Oh, shit.
I found this out by trespassing on the anniversary of that week a few years later. So I thought I had a really good idea, but they were all watching, so it was a bad idea.
That is the way that works. Yeah, no. You at least knew that you were referencing something. I was just wandering around. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else? Question? Yeah.
What was the publishing process like with the Sapling Cage? Like, did you submit it to different presses, or I'm guessing you didn't have an agent, but just curious to learn more about that process.
Oh, I actually do have an agent. But the Sapling Cage has been by far the hardest book for me to publish. Actually, my two mainstream published books are these Danielle Kane books, and actually I got my agent out of those. Normally you have to get an agent and then they go, but I like networked my way into something. Anyway, and I wound up with an agent, and then I was like, my career is coming together. I got these mainstream books. There's this book I've always wanted to write and read. I've always wanted, this is the book I wish I had when I was a kid. And so I finished it. It took me forever. I was so proud of it. I sent it to my agent. My agent's like, this is great. And he couldn't sell it. And this was probably 2017 or something like that. This is actually, I wrote this book a decent while ago. And he couldn't sell it because the YA market was collapsing at that time. And he couldn't sell it. Obviously, I have like my version in my head where it has to do with transness. But honestly, the way that in my mind has to do with transness, one, I think that it's like, I think publishers were a little bit more shy of something like that, and it probably needed to be more otherwise normal, I think, for them to sell it to their audience, they might have felt at the time. And one of the other things that has really come up with this book is that, a lot of the editors who really liked it but ended up passing on it, is that the YA market has a very specific genre requirement about the emotional headspace of the protagonist that I don't meet because my protagonist is a little bit distanced from her own emotional state, and she's a little bit looking at it, right? And is a little bit detached. And I didn't know that wasn't normal. But I was like, whenever they pass on it, I'd just be like, hey, imagine not knowing what your fucking body looks like till you're 34 years old. Like, I'm writing about a trans girl who doesn't know she's a trans girl. I'm writing about my own experience of being a teenager. And I can't speak for other trans women, but I believe that was part of why I had some emotional distance from myself, And, but it, fortunately, kind of in the post-collapse of YA world, there's like more and more of crossover as a genre, which y'all are in a library. You might know more about this than I do. I learned about it because my publisher was like, hey, we want to publish it as crossover. And I was like, that's great. What's that? And it's YA where you admit that the audience is also a bunch of adults, And what's interesting about it is it doesn't turn into like YA but more sex. I still want you all to read the book, but there's no sex in it. The protagonist is Demi, and and a little bit busy with the whole world-ending thing, and like there's not enough time for a love triangle. I'm sorry. There's like a best friends argument triangle, Anyway, whatever, and I was gonna spoil something from book 3, and I'm not going to. Shit, I completely lost my train of thought. Anyway, I think that probably answered it. I just lost my train of thought, though. Yeah.
Hi. You kind of started to answer this almost just in this last answer. So the Sapling Cage is the first in a series. Sorry, thank you. The Sapling Cage is the first in a series. So did you go into it knowing that you wanted to do a series? Did it kind of develop into a series? And it sounds like you already have thoughts about book 3. So maybe the whole thing is kind of in your head and you know where you're sectioning it. I'm curious about that.
So yes and no. Like, so I don't have everything about the book. I know how like the relationships end up in the book. And I absolutely went into it being like, I'm going to try and write the first book in a trilogy. And this was part because I was like, I want to write a trilogy. And part also the witches are obsessed with everything being in 3s in this book anyway. And I'm not going to be able to totally section it off into like, one of the ways the witches perceive the world is that there's 3 ways to enact your will, and one is action, and one is words, and one is magic. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do one of each in the thing. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to pull that off or not. Although I'm like, maybe. And although who wants to read the talking book? And one of the best compliments I ever got was that you write really good meeting scenes. And I was like, thanks. It's still worth reading the book. I know there's no sex, and I just told you there's lots of meetings. If you're poly enough, it's the same thing. I mean, like, and not in like a fun way where the meetings turn into everyone having sex, but instead sex is a bunch of meetings. Anyway, and so, but then the other thing is that there's like a little bit, like when I wrote the Danielle Kane book, the first one, I absolutely wrote it open-ended because I wanted more work. And I was like, oh, look, it ends on a cliffhanger. Don't you want to buy more of them? And they were like, we want 2. And I was like, that's not a lot. I'll take it, you know? And this one, I wrote ready to accept only selling it. I wrote it ready to have it stand alone, but absolutely intended from the start to have it be a trilogy. And I was like, felt really blessed that the Feminist Press, who's my publisher, had never published YA before, and actually is like more known for its nonfiction, right? And but I think that there's been this like marked change in the way that we communicate radical ideas, or rather the way that we admit we communicate radical ideas, because like like Fraggle Rock is obviously from a while ago, you know, and that's like where I got all of my anarchist ideas. It could be a different question. And no, why am I just going to lose my train of thought at the middle of everything? But they decided to really kind of go all in, because if you try and do a new medium, you kind of have to be like, we're going to do this now, right? And I know this from working in publishers myself, is that like you can't just be like, oh, we did a board game, it's the only one we're going to do. It's an entirely different market, it's an entirely different like, you know, PR setup, it's all this different stuff. And so Feminist Press was like, all right, well, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it right. And I've been like really blown away. And so actually in a lot of ways, I'm grateful that I didn't sell this book in 2017. One, because I mean, I thought it was just gonna be like, oh, like by 2017, it's like, oh, we won the trans thing. Everyone's like down with this is great. This rules. Everyone's coming out. There's not gonna be a backlash about that. That doesn't even make any sense. Why would anyone care? And obviously, we live in a different world than we did in the. I don't know how to pronounce the word halcyon days of 2017. That's a dark thought. Trump was fucking president. Jesus Christ. Anyway, that's my answer to that question. It was yes, a trilogy, yes. I could answer one more, maybe.
Yep, I think we have time for one more.
So I was introduced to your work through your sort of nonfiction side, the podcasting and blog posting, and I was just wondering how your practice of fiction writing kind of ties into that worldview around survival, mutual aid, the topics you podcast about.
Yeah. It's all kind of one thing, where in the same way where I'm like, oh, the witches look at any problem, and is it going to be action or words or magic or whatever, you know? I feel like I kind of do the same thing when I have like a problem, I think like, how do I address it? And I remember realizing this really consciously when years ago, you know, whenever like some new bad thing would happen, there'd be like an escalation in the war in Iraq or something. And my friend would be like, what's the banner at the march gonna say? And I was like, what's our little free propaganda zine going to be called? You know? And it's just like you kind of look at the problem, and then if you're holding a hammer, that's what you want to hit it with. And I didn't get arrested. And so, like, some of the things where I'm like specifically I am concerned with trying to get people interested in preparedness. This is a very important part of my life, and has been for a while. And just literally just because I'm like, I'm willing to be the person who looks crazy and be like, everyone store beans and rice, the bad things are coming, you know? And then like, I bullied a bunch of my friends in Asheville into preparing, and I'm really glad I did, you know? I am personally a hero. No, but I mean, they're amazing people. And like, you know, and so some stuff is subtle. Fiction is subtle, and it's really good at like big picture imagining how we can be, right? But like some of it is just like, hey, like, here's a good water filter. Y'all should have this water filter in your basement. It costs $30. I'll just give it to you. How's that? Please, just take it, you know? A Sawyer, actually, yeah. A Sawyer is a very good, and life straws are fine too, although the ones you have to like suck water through are like, they're good in a pinch, but a little Sawyer filter, they're cheap and they're fine. Yeah, and so, but then also a lot of my nonfiction work around history and things like that absolutely tie into my fiction, just because it's like all working to try and figure out ways we can be and ways we can imagine ourselves. And I hated history as a kid because it was like, I'm not good with faces or names or dates or what happened or I don't know, whatever. And but then instead, once I like had a team, you know, I'm like waving my little like black flag pennant and be like, go team anarchy or whatever, right? Or like decolonization or whatever the fucking thing is, you know? And then I'm like, oh, now I can look at history through this lens, and I'm like, oh, now I'm like rooting for freedom. I'm rooting for mutual aid all throughout history. And then it's the greatest story ever told, and then we're all part of it, and we're like, holy shit, like, because the social movements I read about, I'll be like, and then they did this amazing thing, and it's like, basically this. They'll be like, and then they use public infrastructure to bring in radical speakers, and everyone met each other and all this great stuff, you know? And I'll be like, oh, we do that, you know? Yeah, I swear I'm not going to just hit a trail off on all of, well, I guess I will, because that was the last question. But I think, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.
Yes, and thank you again so much for coming here to Ann Arbor. Everyone, let's give Margaret Killjoy one last warm round of applause. And thank you all for coming.
And I think I'm going to hang out by the book table back there until they kick me out.